everyone, and welcome to the final edition, the last session this academic year for the Human and Sports Performance Series. I'm your host, Anthony Smalls. Today's guest speaker, we have Jenna Tosto Mancuso. She is here to talk about the role of the autonomic nervous system. She is the clinical director for the Abilities Research Center at Mount Sinai Health System. It's a lot of great information on how the brain functions with the eyes and the overall body function. Let's talk about fight or flight. Let's talk about how the brain reacts to certain parts of the body. But overall, let's hope we all learn something as scholar athletes. So, Dr. Tosto Mancuso, take it away.
All right. Good evening, everyone. Thanks for having me. My name is Jenna Tosto Mancuso, and I am a physical therapist and the clinical director of the Abilities Research Center at Mount Sinai. And today we are going to be talking about the autonomic nervous system and sports performance. So to get started, we are going to first introduce the autonomic nervous system. So what is the autonomic nervous system? So when we think about the control of the body, oftentimes we primarily think first of the brain and the spinal cord. But the autonomic nervous system is a branch of what's considered our peripheral nervous system, or the nervous system that innervates our body or helps to control our body, that really has two primary branches: parasympathetic and sympathetic divisions. Now, the parasympathetic division is known as our rest and digest system. So it helps to control processes of our body that help our bodies do exactly that, rest and digest. So things like pupillary constriction or constriction of the pupils of the eyes, increasing salivation, increasing stomach digestion, intestinal digestion. So again, that digest component of rest and digest, as well as things like airway constriction, heart rate slowing down, bladder constriction, reproductive system blood flow increases, again, those resting components. Likewise, the sympathetic division of our autonomic nervous system is responsible for our fight or flight responses. So those are the idea of any responses we would need to heighten our alertness and take action. So things like pupillary dilation, increase heart rate, increase inhibition of stomach digestion and digestive system processes, release of glucose from the liver, release of adrenaline from the kidneys, really making sure that our body system is getting again into that heightened state. And so how our body functions at an everyday basis in homeostasis or on an even keel is through a delicate balance of those two systems, our parasympathetic system and our sympathetic system. And so that balance between the two systems is known as autonomic tone. And so it's very important to consider the autonomic nervous system. And admittedly, it's something we don't really think about very often when not only we're thinking about day-to-day life, but also when we're thinking about sports performance. And so I think it's a really interesting topic. The autonomic nervous system has gotten a bit of good media lately, especially with the advent of wearable devices, things like the Whoop device or the Oura Ring. So devices or wearables that start to give us a little bit more information. And we're going to talk about some of the metrics that are really helpful for athletes and high performance individuals to keep track of and to be aware of in order to understand how the autonomic nervous system can influence sports performance. So again, keeping in mind those two systems really need to work in tandem and in synchrony in order for our bodies to process and function with good accuracy and with good function. And so as we start to think a little bit more, we're again digging into the deep end on this one. When we think about athletics and we think about exercise, how does the autonomic nervous system, and again, that sympathetic and parasympathetic balance, how is it controlled? So there are a number of different mechanisms in our body that help to give information to and control the autonomic nervous system. For starters, if we look over here, this is a picture of the arch of the aorta of the heart, as well as the carotid arteries and the carotid body specifically. And so we have something called a baroreflex response, where our these mechanoreceptors or pressure receptors located by the aorta help to pick up differences in pressure. And so that barrow reflex, or the barrow pressure sensors, it sends information to our brain, specifically to the ventrolateral medulla of the brain, as well as an area called the nucleus tractus solitarius. And so those two primary areas get information about pressure, sensation, and blood flow, and they inform the autonomic nervous system to change the tone of our vasculature in our bodies. Likewise, we can look at other inputs. We have that central command center, like we had mentioned, that comes straight from our brain to our peripheral nervous system, specifically through the vagus nerve, which is a nerve that is responsible for autonomic function. And so it tells our bodies that an autonomic response is needed. Additionally, things like skeletal muscle help to inform our autonomic nervous system to make sure that we're getting more and more information. Particularly, the skeletal muscle is under sympathetic control. So remember our fight or flight response, really giving more and more information for action of that autonomic nervous system. Really important to think about that as we think about exercise. And then when we think about things on the output end of things, we might get more information, like we saw in the beginning, of a difference of balance between release of adrenaline, release of other neurotransmitters and chemicals in the body that help us to respond and appropriately activate either that rest or digest parasympathetic system or that fight or flight sympathetic system. So a really neat process, and these are called feed forward loops or feedback loops, where one thing leads to another in the body, and we get this continuous process of action and reaction to help to modulate our body's function. So a pretty exciting and interesting area of science, if you ask me. One really particular portion of autonomic control that is definitely, again, of more and more interest lately that you might hear a lot about if you're interested in the space of autonomics and sports performance in particular, is that of heart rate variability. And so heart rate variability is a metric that we use that we can measure just through external devices to better understand how the autonomic nervous system is functioning. And more importantly, to understand how our training and our performance are impacting the autonomic nervous system and also are impacted by the autonomic nervous system. So heart rate variability is considered the time change in between consecutive heartbeats. And so when we take our heart rate, we're taking a count of how many beats we're getting per minute of our heartbeat. When we look at heart rate variability, we look at the difference in time between those beats. So this is an example of an echocardiogram or an EKG waveform. And so we have our different waveform here, right? Our QRSTs, our waveforms here, looking at the heart's conductivity, or how is the heart beating. And so we measure heart rate variability in the distance between, and the time distance between each of these beats. And so it's a really great metric to understand autonomic tone or balance, because like we talked about earlier, right, the heart is under the control of the autonomic nervous system for that fight or flight response or rest and digest response. And the heart is definitely one of the main parts of the body where we can see that autonomic nervous system live in action. And so HRV can tell us about autonomic tone or balance. It can tell us globally about heart and vascular tone. It can tell us even about things like gas exchange or gut function. And really, it's crucial to understand that heart rate variability and the autonomic nervous system, they're responsible for this balance between these two components of the ANS. And so really a really important metric for us to understand, and one that I'm going to focus our talk on today to better understand how the autonomic nervous system informs sports performance, as well as our ability to prescribe interventions or prescribe exercise to maximize performance. And so other things that we can think about that might influence heart rate variability. There are, so when we talk about things that can influence the body function, we talk about things that are modifiable and things that are not modifiable. Not modifiable influences are things that we can't change. So for instance, genetics, can't change our genes. Age cannot change how old we are. But things like physical activity and stress oftentimes can be considered modifiable factors. And so stress will absolutely change our heart rate variability and our heart rates in general, as well as physical activity. And so again, we're going to hone in on that physical activity component. So how does the autonomic nervous system impact sports performance? So really, we want to think about the, again, balance of and checks and balances of the sympathetic and parasympathetic system. So when we have a high intensity activity, we have a high intensity sport, oftentimes we see parasympathetic withdrawal and sympathetic activation. So if we think back to that earlier slide that we demonstrated, all of those components of sympathetic activation kick in the midst of a high intensity activity. So it really preps the body for exertion. Something like, again, decreased digestive function and increase in heart rate, as well as increase in airway dilation, so bronchodilation. When we think about, if you are performing a high intensity sport, maybe you are playing soccer, or you are going and you are doing a high intensity activity, you want to make sure that your body is primed to move. So having that airway dilation where you're able to optimize your breathing, having that heart rate increase so that you are getting more blood flow. Your vasculature is responding appropriately to allow for more blood flow and getting more blood flow to the important parts of the body that need it, which thereby allows for more oxygen in the body. All of those components are going to be really, really important. Likewise, if you're performing a high intensity activity, you want to make sure that your body in its whole is getting all of the oxygen and all of the blood flow it needs. So you're going to really want that parasympathetic withdrawal so that you don't have blood flow and necessary oxygen and nutrients and resources going to things like digestion or rest-based function. Similarly, we find that resting heart rate, so your heart rate in general, is lower in athletes than in non-athletes. So you might find that with consistent exercise, that the heart rate at rest is lower for individuals who exercise. Now, when we go back to that concept of heart rate variability, it can be a really useful indicator for the efficacy of training, as well as how well the body is tolerating intensity. So when we think about heart rate variability in general, higher variability, we look to expect that individuals who are overtraining will see a sudden drop in their heart rate variability. And so that sudden drop in heart rate variability from a physiological level tells us that the body is not tolerating as well a high overtraining or overloading activity. So we really want to think about that, again, checks and balances, making sure that it's not one system going higher into effect than the other. Studies have shown that the autonomic nervous system can modulate performance, again, by increasing that sympathetic tone as intensity of competition increases. So this was a really cool study done where they looked at individuals who were performing in a snowboarding competition, a high intensity snowboarding competition. And what they tracked was heart rate variability and some of the really crucial metrics of heart rate variability. There are certain components of that variability that are of interest to science so that we can really understand just what exactly is going on with that autonomic nervous system. And what they found was as the intensity of the competition increased, so the task became more challenging, the intensity and the pressure of the competition increased, there was a similar increase in sympathetic tone, so sympathetic activation, vagus nerve activation, that really helped athletes push to the finish line. And additionally, increase in that sympathetic tone was shown to be correlated with improved sports performance. So again, that sensitivity of the autonomic nervous system to kick in when it's necessary, but then thereby after pull back when it's no longer needed for that high intensity performance, again, was correlated with improved performance overall. Now, when we think about athletes in general, we know, right, there are a wide variety of different athletes. For athletes who participate in endurance activities, so things like marathons, ultra marathons, long distance aerobic activity that really requires our bodies to respond to heart rate and control. And so what we have found is that individuals who participate in endurance athletes or endurance athletics, there are certain aspects of parasympathetic tone that might be more prevalent in these athletes. And so that is definitely suggestive of that training effect of aerobic exercise on the parasympathetic nervous system. And again, we oftentimes in a correlative fashion find that endurance athletes also have lower resting heart rates. So we're seeing a trend here. And so just as a summary, I really like this picture. This is from a publication from Fu and Levine, two researchers who are incredibly prevalent in the field of autonomics, that proposed the role of exercise on the autonomic nervous system. And so like we've discussed in our talk today, right, we see an increase in vagal tone, decreases in heart rate that are consistent with aerobic exercise. It talks here in this corner here about cardiac size and cardiac function. So improvements in cardiac function, improvements in hemoglobin mass and blood plasma volume. So components of our blood, our actual blood circulating, hemoglobin being the oxygen carrying component of our blood, that's elevated. Improvements in renal adrenal function. So we talked about the release of adrenaline in response to sympathetic activity, really improving there. Decreases in blood pressure, which is always a good thing from a health and wellness perspective. That baroreflex sensitivity or sensitivity of that whole feedback loop we talked about that helps with vascular control. Sensitivity of those systems is really important, again, just to be agile in response to our activity. And lastly, an important thing to highlight would be insulin resistance and improved insulin tolerance or release of insulin from the liver, right? All of those components are really important to start to paint the picture, not only of the benefits of exercise and sports performance, but also how the autonomic nervous system is so tightly intertwined with all of these benefits that we more globally hear about anyway. And so to sum up our talk here, these are some of our references, but really thinking about the autonomic nervous system as a pivotal portion of our sports performance, something that we often don't take into account, but I think is really important for us to think about, especially as we talk about training and exercise, and how can we optimize our training. So definitely thinking about metrics outside of just heart rate, but also considering things like HRV or heart rate variability as a helpful metric. So I hope that was informative. It is a new and exciting, or rather a developing and exciting topic. And that is where we'll end today.
Thank you very much. We appreciate the presentation. I wanted to ask, the flight or flight, is that something where your eyes see something and it kind of registers signals from the brain to the brain to tell the body to start either trying to run, freeze, or stay put? Is that the concept behind fight or flight?
Yeah, so the visual processing component of fight or flight is definitely a part of it. And that's really where that pupillary dilation and pupillary constriction component of it comes in. So with the sympathetic division being responsible for pupillary dilation, definitely a component of it. So your body perceives a potential, like if we go back to the idea of, your body at its core, fight or flight, rest and digest, perceives a threat, if you will, not in response to exercise, but perceives a threat. You want to make sure that your body's ready to mobilize. And so you want to be able to respond to said threat. So you kick in the sympathetic division of your autonomic nervous system. Now that translates now to something like athletics, where it's not a threat, but you want to prime your body for higher activity or higher activation. So the sympathetic division will kick in more.
Okay. Dr. Martin, did you have a question?
Yeah, I'm very interesting because I was and my twin sister also national athlete, but we'll hear a little bit about that, but not too much. But now my twin sister have a COVID long, and said our autonomous nervous system was completely everywhere, but not like what you need to do. So this come back to us, and we didn't really realize how it was so important for a lot of stuff we don't realize. And even as an athlete, we didn't have all the notion. And now, as your presentation show, like if I know that before, maybe some stuff I'm doing, maybe I should change, or maybe thinking another way when I was doing a training and all this stuff. But so it was very interesting. And so thank you very much. And we hear more and more now that like how the menstruation can affect success or competition. But also for me, I remember when I was doing competition, I was like able, or like feel impression, I was able to change when I'm going to start my menstruation, not to fall during the competition. And do you know if it was like just have the impression I was able to delay it or make earlier, or it was really like the training or the fact we are like ready for the competition, we affect our menstruation cycle?
So I think so when we think about the autonomic nervous system, I guess to start, number one, I think you brought up a really terrific point. We're hearing a lot about the autonomic nervous system in individuals who have long COVID. And so I think that is also an area that you're going to hear a lot more about this autonomic nervous system, particularly the phrase dysautonomia. And just to touch on that, it's this imbalance of sympathetic versus parasympathetic systems. And so absolutely, we want to be thinking about that. When we think about female athletes and control of things like menstruation, it definitely can be variable in terms of what system is involved. Usually we find that there is an endocrine component, so balance of the endocrine system that is impacted with that, but there can be other impacts of the autonomic nervous system as well. So like you had pointed out, it's something that oftentimes we don't think about when we think about athletics and training, but definitely the autonomic nervous system can be involved.
Okay. But how we can really, as an athlete, to check if we have a good balance to do the exercise, because we don't have any metric. We just like, but in some time we need to try to control or to improve and to use a good one on the good times. But how we know we're doing correctly, or which way to do that?
Sure, absolutely. That's a great question as well. So heart rate variability and heart rate variability wearables are becoming more and more popular. So it's kind of like along the same lines, something like an iWatch can track now. If you don't have access to something that's tracking heart rate variability, you can just use heart rate in general and train within heart rate zones. So typically speaking, for an individual who's doing like moderate intensity physical activity or aerobic exercise, training in a 70 to 80% zone of an age predicted heart rate maximum. So we take a formula to calculate heart rate maximums per age, and calculating out 70 to 80% of that is equivalent to moderate intensity exercise. And so if training in that moderate intensity zone, typically speaking, generally speaking, 5 days per week we look at is considered optimal training. And then for individuals who are looking to train more as elite athletes, they may train in higher heart rate zones to gain a more optimal sports performance effect, but definitely can be a helpful metric as well.
Okay. But I remember when we say the 70 or 80% of like, oh, for the exercise, or sometimes need to do a shorter peak of or lowest to change the type of activity, but also prepare the body for some specific exercise.
Yes.
But I think when I was doing that, I didn't realize really how much the impact on the body, and yeah, it's sad in the same time not to, I was this time not aware about how all this work. But you said the gut like they also can impact the result, and the gut are like play a big role. But how he make, because I remember our coach didn't want us to go to McDonald's before, but he accept when we have like a success, even if after we are like another like swimming to do. But how he play really the food and what we eat on the on the autonomous nervous system.
Sure. So I think globally, when we think about sports performance, that is definitely a very, very in-depth topic, just nutrition in general and how our body metabolizes nutrients and utilizes nutrients. And admittedly, I will save that for my colleagues in nutrition who probably do much more justice. But when we think about the autonomic nervous system in general, when we think about our parasympathetic division, that division of the autonomic nervous system is incredibly important for our rest and digest function. So it optimizes and promotes stomach digestion, intestinal digestion, really the entire process in and of itself. And so we find that that component of it, if we think about what parts of training you're using your sympathetic versus your parasympathetic system more, and what portions of training that you're doing your rest and recovery, right? Your recovery phases are more optimized for digestion. And so we see that more in our more passive phases or more restful states than if we were actively in our sympathetic state. Now, again, as to what nutrition is necessary to optimize performance, I think that that is a more intricate process in and of itself, because it also largely depends on glucose metabolism and how our bodies are utilizing nutrients to perform. But globally speaking, we see digestion being mediated by that parasympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system.
Yeah, make a challenge, because there are like this auto interaction between what we take from like environmental action and what also how we act the body. Oh yeah.
Yes, it's a two-way relationship, what we put in and what we get out of it. Absolutely. Yeah.
So yeah. I don't have other question now, but so maybe
this is great.
Yeah.
I appreciate the questions. These are great.
Okay, so thank you so much for your time. We appreciate it. And if anybody wants to reach you, what's the best way that they can either reach you or look up some references in terms of the presentation that you gave today?
Definitely. You can absolutely reach me at my Mount Sinai email. It's Jenna.Tosto@mountsinai.org. And if anyone has any questions or wants to chat a little bit more, I'm always up for a good conversation about the autonomic nervous system. So feel free to reach out.
Yeah, I have one more question, sorry. So you are a researcher, or you work with athletes and you also try to improve their capacity?
So I am actually a physical therapist by training. I am a neurological clinical specialist. And so I currently in my role, I'm a clinical researcher. So I serve as the clinical director at the Abilities Research Center, where our mission is dual-fold. It's acceleration of novel technology and new paradigms in clinical practice. So I treat across the spectrum, everything from individuals who have had concussions or athletes, all the way through individuals who have had brain injuries and stroke, individuals with long COVID. So I treat pretty much across the spectrum. And a lot of my interest is in the role of the autonomic nervous system in improving outcomes in rehabilitation. Okay,
and so you use as this case some device to measure their capacity and to see when you're doing some intervention is impact these different parameters and stuff like that.
We absolutely have capacity to do that. Yes. My personal research in this area, I have more of a focus from a research perspective in the role of autonomic rehabilitation in dysautonomia. But yes, our lab does do a lot of work with wearables and devices that can track these things.
Cool. Continue to do that, because my sister, now I'm no more athlete, so I don't, just for fun, but for my sister now with COVID long.
Yes. Well, anything we can do to help, please don't hesitate to connect. I'd be happy to help.
Yeah, thank you very much.
My pleasure.
Thank you so much, everyone, for coming. We look forward to seeing y'all next year when we come back with another series of the Human and Sports Performance. I'm your host, Anthony Smalls. Take care, everyone.